I was listening to Tim Pool, and Ian Crossland almost ended up giving me an aneurysm. Uh, First, understand, I love Ian being on the show. I'm glad he's there. I'm glad for his insight. Uh, but the history part of this, it was just painful for a moment. And the only reason I'm going to highlight it is because it's the although I'm not saying lots of people believe what he's saying, lots of people believe portions of what he's saying, and this actually causes a lot of problems. So let's give a quick listen.
I see like the liberal economic order. We've basically since World War II, we were like, no more world wars like that. No more dictators across the sea to spark up a war. So we'll put military bases everywhere, and by threat of arms and murder, we'll prevent another dictator. Which essentially we have. There hasn't been a third world war. But the other option was we're going full on isolationist. We do not want military bases anywhere. And then what happened was Hitler appeared. So
Oh, okay, so understanding what happens at basically late stage World War One. Up until World War One, we're looking at a situation where virtually every war in Europe, uh, the powers fight. Even when they end up occupying the enemy capital, the nation states remain. They just readjust borders, lose overseas territories, etc. A good example being the Franco-Prussian War in the late 1800s. Uh, the Prussians actually end up occupying Paris and pretty much the whole of the country. And once they come to a conclusion of the war, there's a change on the frontier where the Prussians, which are essentially the Germans, end up with Alsace and Lorraine and pick off some of France's overseas colonies. And French end up paying reparations. There's no reason to believe that World War One wouldn't have ended the same way. Essentially, by 1917, the powers were reaching the point of total exhaustion, and it would have been at some point that they would have had to sit down and negotiate, and essentially the borders would have shifted. Someone would have had to pay reparations, and Europe would have remained the same as it always had. But the problem is the United States entered this war and upset the old balance, uh, bringing in industrial might and manpower and the potential for much more on, because I mean, to a certain extent, the Europeans would say that by the time the United States came, Germany was pretty much already broken, and the United States just kind of pushed them over the edge. I'll dispute that to a certain extent, but let's accept that for this argument. So the thing is France no longer had the will to push forward. Britain couldn't do it by themselves, and France had a legitimate reason for not being able to push forward. I mean, the beating they'd taken in manpower was just unbelievable. No nation could hold up under those stresses. So at a point where all the countries should have been ready to sit down, the United States enters the war with the prospect of being able to just bring in essentially unlimited manpower and materials to one side. Uh, Even if the United States wasn't doing it all by themselves at that point, the ability of anybody, the Central Powers, Germany and its allies, to continue was long gone at this point. So the United States changed the old world order. So they brought about the idea of pretty much total destruction to the enemy. No country, to my knowledge, had ever been given a demoralizing treaty where their military was stripped to practically nothing. The entry of the United States ended up prolonging the fighting and adding significant casualties. Many more people died and were permanently damaged than would have if the United States hadn't entered. The prolonged fighting probably ended France's ability to really be a decent fighting power from that point on. The additional casualties broke their morale, and that morale stayed broken up through World War II. And there's a possibility if the war had ended earlier, France might have been in a better state, where France would have remained a power that could potentially stand up to a future Germany. Uh, by the war being prolonged, we end up getting the release of Lenin into Russia's revolution, bringing communism. Now, the revolution may have come anyway. Communism might have came anyway, but the United States not being involved might have limited what impacts the revolution had. And ultimately, we end up with the humiliation of Germany via the Treaty of Versailles. Another issue brought in by the United States intervening into the war, Germany was essentially attempting to sue for peace directly through the United States, essentially because of Wilson's 14 points of peace. Uh, and the United States said outright that they would not negotiate with a monarchy. And so the government was overthrown and replaced with a republican form of government. Uh, so it was imposed upon them because they were desperately hoping for better terms for the United States than they thought they were going to get from France and Britain. And inadvertently, we ended up imposing a republican form of government on a nation that was not ready for one. Uh, the people didn't understand it. The people didn't necessarily want it, at least not as a whole. And the German establishment definitely was not wanting a republican form of government. So, in the end, intervention into this war upset the old world balance, possibly caused communism to become a thing in terms of actually becoming the government of a country. Uh, and certainly set the stage for the eventual rise of Hitler, and probably contributed to a weaker France that was unable to stand against a future Hitler. Uh, One of the things Ian suggests is the idea that if we'd put bases up all over the world, we could have stopped Hitler from showing up. Uh, Post World War I, the U.S. was not the hegemon it is after World War II. You essentially have two worldwide empires, the French and the British. There was no places they were going to allow us to set up bases. We had not conquered territory. At the end of World War II, we had conquered and occupied Germany, France, and Japan. Now, mind you, France was liberated, but essentially we were the military power holding everything together. By right of conquest and treaties, we're able to set up bases and occupy these nations. This was not the case after World War I. Our attempts to set up the League of Nations at best would have made the U.S. a junior partner to the British Empire in attempting to assert some new form of world order. The League of Nations did not work. Maybe it would have with U.S. involvement, but the thing is you have to understand that if the British are the senior partner in establishing a new world peace, that probably means we would have a resurgent Germany at a certain point, and I'll explain that. So, in some ways, the rise of Hitler, at least from the German side, has a certain amount of inevitability. From the British side, it has a little help. So, with the end of World War I, the German establishment was not happy with the new government it had. They pretty much were of a mind that they wanted a strongman government like they had before under the Kaiser. Their goal was to eventually reinstate the prince and form some new form of republican monarchy with a much more powerful monarchy than most of the other constitutional monarchies of Europe. Uh, by happenstance, the way history turned out, they ended up getting Hitler instead as their strongman. Now, one needs to understand that the British had a long-running policy of what they called continental balance. Is their goal was always to keep the continent of Europe in such a way that there were two strong entities, either two strong nations or two strong groups of nations facing off on each other. So that one, not one power would end up being dominant in Europe. So one of the things the British very quickly recognized following World War One is the French were incapable, due to the heavy losses they took during the war, of being that power. And the British were very frightened of the rise of the Soviet Union, and they saw the continent as being out of balance militarily, that eventually Russia would become absolutely dominant unless some other power rose to fill the void. France and its little Entente weren't going to fit the bill. So that's why the British, as a part of policy, deliberately allowed Germany to rearm in violation of the Versailles Treaty. Uh, it was stuff that was well out. It was out in the open enough that all the intelligence services knew what was going on, and it was condoned by the British because they wanted somebody in the center of Europe to be able to block the advancement of a future powerful Russia. So they also were, because it's historically misrepresented that all the land grabs that Germany did prior to World War II were a function of appeasement. And there were definitely appeasers in the British camp, but there are also realpolitik people who were attempting to rebuild and make a much stronger Germany than there was in order to stop future Russian advances. Okay, so at that point, if we look at what happened after World War One, there's nothing the U.S. could have done to have stopped that. And if the U.S. had stayed in the League of Nations as Great Britain's junior partner, Great Britain would have been pretty much calling the shots on the continent, and it's very likely the exact same situation would arose again. Without U.S. troops occupying the continent, which would not have happened, Britain would still be looking to rebalance the continent, and Germany would still be the only candidate to do it. So uh, either the way it happened, where we weren't involved and we went back to our normal status quo of not being involved in Europe, wouldn't have changed things. Neither would have it been if we'd been acting as Britain's right-hand man in setting up their new world order. Now, let's go one step further, because there's the implication when Hitler rises, the assumption is that the only way it stops is with the United States getting involved. Well, one thing to understand is that no matter how, if everything had gone Germany's way somehow, if things had gone as well as it possibly could have, it's highly unlikely Germany would have ever left the continental area of Europe. They would have never been able to cross the water and actually deal Britain a major blow. The British Navy would have stopped them. The Germans never had a navy strong enough to counter the British. It's reasonably plausible that Germany could have been defeated by Britain and the USSR alone. Now, the resulting damage to all sides would have been catastrophic, but it's well within the realm of possibility. Germany had bitten off a lot more than it could chew. Obviously, U.S. being involved in World War II made it easier on everybody to pull this off. But let's go crazy and far-fetched here, and let's say somehow, without the U.S. involved, the Germans end up victorious somehow. Well, at best, they would have been a continental empire. Uh, at best, they probably would have pushed as far as the Ural Mountains. And they would have had a hard time controlling all this new land and new people. They would have been so preoccupied that that would have been probably the absolute advance they would have ever been able to make under Hitler. And then the most likely thing that happens at Hitler's death is this new German empire probably would have splintered because none of the higher ups were particularly fond of each other, and it's very unlikely that any one of them would have accepted the other as being the new Fuhrer. I mean, we see this at the end of World War II. As people suspect Hitler is either dead, incapacitated, or blocked from communication, they all start stepping up and declaring themselves in charge. So, I guess that's the end of my little mini rant there. The idea generally is that I don't think, well, one, I do think U.S. involvement in World War I made things much worse. I don't think much of anything we would have did would have prevented Hitler. I don't think there's anything that could have really prevented Hitler other than if the British had adopted a policy other than balancing the continent. And ultimately, in the end, Germany was always the largest threat Germany was ever going to pose was to all its neighbors in Europe. And the likelihood of it ever being a true threat to the United States was very unlikely. All right, well, I appreciate you spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video. Please consider smashing the like button. What do you think of my comments here? Is Ian got a good point? Do you think some of the points I brought up don't make sense? Please talk about them in the comment section below. Do you agree with me? Say that in the comment section below as well. If there's somebody out there you think might find this interesting, please share it with them. And please consider subscribing to my channel. I put out several of these videos each week.